Hello everyone, welcome. It's been a while. I haven't uploaded any videos for about 3 or 4 days. Today is the 4th of September 2023. Let me tell you what I have been doing. I have been actually watching a lot of French programs, debates, videos on the current situation in the world. Most of it about the war, what is going on, the geopolitics of it all. And I thought I would I've been binging on all these French programs because I wanted to see how they debated, how the take that they have on it. I was actually rather surprised that although they complain about the media being, a government propaganda machine and all the mainstream media and so on, they complain about it the same as we do in the UK and America and so on. But there is a difference in that they assume something and they say it out loud as if it is, just taken for granted that everyone agrees with it. That surprised me. And they say it out loud. They express it in a way that I don't think we do in the Anglosphere. They assume, for example, and they will say things like the European nations have become colonies, of this one superpower and so on. I know that we can hear this in the English-speaking world, but they say it in such a different way that it is as they just take it for granted that everyone agrees with it and everyone understands it and so on. So they look at it also not so much experts coming to talk, but from a more philosophical angle. It's just a different approach. And so I watched many of them, and I thought I'm going to share this with you, the way they are talking about it and the take that they have on them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to follow for most of my talk today. I'm going to follow one particular person called Francois Asselinau. I don't know this gentleman. I have never heard of him. I suppose because of the way he says things that he is on the right. But he has one video. Is quite old. It's about 9 months old, but it is a summary, an introduction of how we got to where we are. And because it's such an old video and starts at the very beginning, a little bit of the history of the Ukraine and Russia and this and that, and takes us all the way to where we were 9 months ago. He's not going, in this particular video, he's not going to talk about the intricacies of what is happening today or what happened yesterday, but more in a sort of a general form. And so I'm going to follow him in how he introduces everything. So I will obviously give you the link down below. So if you want to watch it in French, that's you can watch it too. So so let's start. So the first question that he asks is, why did Russia invade Ukraine? And then he says, okay, let us go back to history, because obviously, as we all know and we have heard it didn't really start on the 22nd, 24th of February 2022. He assumes that. Okay, so let's go back to how these two nations came to loathe, perhaps even hate each other. What is it? Okay, so he starts by saying, let us go back a little bit, and he starts by saying that what do we know about Ukraine. Okay, why do we need to go back, first of all? Because especially we seem to be hearing a story where, it's as if it was a Western, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and things are not as simple as that. We all know that. So let us go back to history and create a sort of a framework to separate a little bit the wheat from the chaff, as it were. Okay, so what is Ukraine? Well, we know that it is a very fertile country, a very fertile soil. The western part had in earlier times been the western part to the Dnieper River, I believe. It had been part of Poland and Lithuania for a long time. These two countries and this part of Ukraine had been a whole. It was an entity under the duchy, I believe it was, of Poland. And even today, many Polish nationalists believe that region of Ukraine, the western part, it was theirs and it could be theirs again, let us say, perhaps all the way to the Black Sea. But, all right, so without entering, this is going to be a summary, even though I fear that it might be a little bit too long, but if you can bear with me. Summarizing a lot, at any rate. In 1654, there was a treaty. There was the Treaty of Pereslayav, I'm reading here. And this, the territory known today as Ukraine, but the western part of Ukraine, which had belonged to Poland, okay, will be along the Dnieper River. Okay, so the eastern part of Ukraine, what is Ukraine today, that was not originally part of this Ukraine. It was totally different. The frontier was the river, I believe. And so the eastern part was Russia. It was always Russia. So Ukraine as such was that western part that had belonged to Poland. Okay. And that was under the Tsar, let me see, Alexander I, Tsar of all Russias. That is when that treaty was signed. Kiev was part of Russia. In fact, many people believe that is where the center of Russia, where Russia started, let me put it that way. Now, why is this important, this history of going back to 1654? Because it's very much part of the Russian mentality, that this Kiev is part of Russia, right? The word Ukraine means border or frontier, something like that. Now, during the following centuries, this Ukraine, this western part of Ukraine that had been part of Poland, now part of Russia, will be seen as a bridge, as it were, between the Russian world and the rest of Europe, the western part of Europe. In other words, it's like a bridge between the east and the west, kind of thing. This is 1654. Now, after, a few centuries, 1917, the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, this territory of what was Western Ukraine, which was now part of Russia and had been since 1654, was renamed, as many other regions in the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, and many regions would be named this, the Soviet Socialist Republic of, whatever it was. In in Central Asia to many parts. Okay, so that was accepted. It was imposed, but without any problems there. They were just changing the name, as it were. So in this territory of Ukraine, in this redefining of this region, Stalin actually joined to this western part. Stalin joined the eastern part, what is now the eastern part, the problem areas, the Lugansk and the Donetsk, which had always been Russian, had never been part of Ukraine as such, but Stalin joined them to what we now know as Ukraine. Okay, so joined them together. This again was not seen as terribly important at the time, or no one complained, or if they did complain, well, he wouldn't have done much good at any rate. This was Stalin. Okay, so he joined these two parts, probably for internal reasons. Okay. Okay, but this eastern part had always been Russian in culture, in language, in religion, everything. Okay, so now you have in one Soviet Socialist Republic, what you have is, as it were, two different nations. You remember nation, people who have the same God, the same language, the same culture, the same everything. And now you have this Ukraine, which has people that are culturally different, because the western part had always been, let's say, more European. Yes, the eastern part more Russian. Now they are together in this republic. The western part had always looked more towards the west, as it were, the eastern part towards the east. However, already in the from 1920 to 1930, there's going to be a huge problem. What is the huge problem? This is going to mark the Ukrainian mentality and the Ukrainian soul, as it were. Because what happens is what many people refer to, and it could have well been a genocide. And the Ukrainians, the Western Ukrainians, although now they're on one whole, but the Western part saw themselves explicitly attacked by Stalin in a genocide that killed, I think it's 2 or 3 million people in that particular time. I'm sure that this is correct. However, I would like to add that this was not happening to just that part of Ukraine, to the Ukrainians. It was also happening to the eastern Ukrainians. What was happening is that Stalin was trying to force down their throats the communist, manifesto, as it were, that no private property was allowed. And in this area, which has such fertile soil, there were many small farmers, bigger ones, smaller ones, but it seemed to have been perhaps a minifundia kind of peasantry where you have your own plot of land or perhaps acres, and it was yours. This is what he was trying to get rid of, this private property. Perhaps there were more in the Ukraine because of the farming thing, but I don't know whether it was just, targeting Western Ukrainians as such. I think the eastern part is actually the most fertile part, as I understand it, so they must have suffered too, and they were Russians, so I don't know, but this had a very, very profound in the Ukrainian soul, and so it generated this anti-Russian sentiment, Perhaps he should have been anti-Soviet, really, or anti-communist or something. But anyway, this anti-Russian thing started, that is going to grow. Okay, so that is how it started. Now, Second World War. A significant part of the Western Ukrainians, I'm going to say Eastern and Western, not because I don't accept that it is one whole Ukraine, but because there was this difference in culture, in language, and so on. So you know what I mean, right? So in the Second World War, these Western Ukrainians who spoke Ukrainian, they had their own language, although they all spoke Russian, but they had their own language. Actually, because of the anti-Soviet or anti-Russian sentiment that they had, okay, they saw an opportunity. They took the opportunity when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. They took this as an opportunity to liberate themselves away from the Soviet yoke. Okay, still feeling not Soviet but Russian. Okay, so many of them actually welcomed Hitler's troops and the Germans because they saw an opportunity here to liberate themselves and seek independence from the Soviet Union. And this created in turn a very strong nationalist movement. Some call it ultra-nationalist, whatever, but it could be also very violent, to tell you the truth. But as we will see later, but they saw the opportunity. Now, in 1954, away from that, after the Second World War, they obviously didn't succeed. They remained part of the Soviet Union, yes. In 1954, something else happened, and that is Stalin was dead now, and Khrushchev was in power. The Khrushchev, the same of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Khrushchev was in power, and 1954, they were going to celebrate the 300th anniversary of that treaty of Pereslayav, where this part of Ukraine, the western part that had belonged to Poland, became part of Russia. So, in order to celebrate it, part of the celebration is that let me hold on. Perhaps to alleviate, to attenuate this anti-Soviet spirit, Khrushchev, as a gift, grants to Ukraine the peninsula of Crimea, to this Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. So now you have, this was as a gift, okay? Again, they didn't think there would be any problems because it was all the Soviet Union, so ahead they went. So what you have now is Ukraine, which had been the western part. Then the eastern part was added by Stalin to this country, and now Khrushchev added Crimea as a gift in 1954, probably also for internal reasons, okay? So now you have Ukraine, which also has Lugansk and Donetsk. They're fighting now, yes? And also Crimea. Okay, and Crimea had always been Russian. When I say always, I mean, in Europe, frontiers and invasions have changed so many times. But certainly since Catherine the Great, Catherine II, Catherine the Great, and who had united the whole of the Russian territory in the 18th century. And Crimea had actually belonged to the Ottoman Empire, to today's Turkey, basically. Okay, so nothing to do with Ukraine, which was kind of a different nation. They had come from fighting that. Anyway, Catherine the Great united everything, and so Crimea became Russian in the 18th century, and now it was added to this new Ukraine. Okay. Now, since then, there has always been a very, very important, very significant, extremely important Russian military base there in Crimea. Since Catherine the Great, there is the city there called Sevastopol, which means Sebastian, really, with warm, deep waters and a support for the Russian Navy. It has been there since the 18th century. The Russians see it as a strategic jewel, okay, for the Russian Navy. And now in the current conflict, the mere idea that this could be passed to the West or to NATO, I'm jumping ahead, but to American hands, Russians find themselves almost incapable of accepting this. But I'm jumping ahead, so let me go back to a little bit of history. Now, in 1992, as you know, 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. And the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine becomes independent, like many others, like the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. And obviously, it takes with it, because it belonged to it, it takes with it the eastern part and Crimea, obviously. Okay, so now Ukraine is what used to be, plus Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea. And under international law, that was correct. It belonged to them. What happens after this? Well, the Soviet Union collapses. In 1991, Russia is weakened, very weak, more actually moribund in its deathbed practically. And now we have in Russia Boris Yeltsin, whose, after Gorbachev, whose election was helped along by America. I don't think we can dispute that. He was a man who had personal problems. Apparently he was an alcoholic, etc., etc., but he could not control the disintegration. The country was falling apart and he could not control it. He could not organize it. So what we see here then is that basically, if we are honest about it, we have to say that the West, not us ordinary folk, but I mean the people with money and so on, they came and they just basically raped it of a lot of its wealth. Okay, it was taken to the West. You heard of the Russian oligarchs. Okay, well, these were people who perhaps were the heads of departments, the heads of agencies, and they were taking everything for themselves, or selling things to the West, to Western investors and so on. And no one was controlling this. It's not only major things, but even files, documents. They were all taken. They're all in American universities. The country was really rampaged, if we are honest about it. And what was happening? Okay, so what was happening were, for example, an ordinary person would not receive his pension, for example. Where is my pension? No, we are not paying pensions anymore. People were suddenly unemployed. Anyway, so do you see the mess, the absolute mess? Apparently in the 1990s, a terrible decade for Russia. People were committing suicide right, left and center, and alcoholism and all kinds of things. It was, for them, it was such a sudden change and a collapse of everything that they had known, and everything was being sold or taken away. You can imagine that situation, okay? The Russians still regard Boris Yeltsin and, to a certain extent, Gorbachev as traitors. That is the word used by one of my Russian students when I was teaching him. They were traitors. And I was trying to say to him, no, Gorbachev was a good man who was trying to, open up this. He said, no, but this is a 17-year-old. He said, no, they could have done things differently. They just let it all fall apart. Perhaps not so suddenly, perhaps more, step by step. Anyway, they are not loved in the Soviet Union and in Russia, but certainly Boris Yeltsin. So I say this because I think it's important to know how they feel about this, okay? So they felt that the whole you don't have to agree with this, but just put yourself in their shoes. They feel that the whole inheritance of what the country had been, their inheritance of a country, had been given away. The leaders had let it be stolen, as they see it. In any case, wherever it was, nevertheless, with all this going on, Ukraine becoming independent, nevertheless, Russia enters into a contract, an agreement to which Ukraine agreed to, that to rent, as it were, Crimea as a port. That is where they had always had their navy. So they enter into an agreement, and Russia can continue to use Sevastopol as a port for the Russian navy. What else? Gorbachev accepts. This is a long story, obviously, but you all know about it. But I'll just mention it. Accepts the reunification of Germany. He agrees to do away with the Warsaw Pact, the equivalent of NATO, under the promise given by the United States that no, don't worry about NATO. NATO, as you've all heard a million times, will not extend 1 inch to the east. But they did. I mean, can we accept that the United States cheated here a little bit? All right. So already in 1991, President Bush, the father, he visited Poland, and at the Warsaw University, this is 1991, practically immediately afterwards, said that very important sentence. He said that all of the countries of Eastern Europe that now wanted to become part of, or working towards becoming part of, the European Union, before they became part of the European Union, they will have to enter NATO. They would not become part of the European Union unless they joined NATO. In other words, the two sides of the coin. Yes, the European Union, the economic part, and the NATO side of it, the military part. All right, so Russia feels cheated, but it is too weak to do anything about it. So all of these countries become part of NATO. Russia was left sort of holding the bag. Excuse me. In the sense that they had given up with they had cancelled the Warsaw. I have a mosquito or something here. They had cancelled the Warsaw Pact and everything, and now they're there sort of holding the baby, as it were. Okay, too weak to do anything about it. I mean, they couldn't even pay the pensions of the older people. So Russia had no choice but to swallow it, okay, swallow what is happening. As the Americans said, when the house is in flames, this is the time to ravage it. So the US, who's not Mother Teresa necessarily, well, takes advantage of the whole situation. They looked at it as, you know, to the victor go the spoils. And so, okay. Now, moving on. 2001. Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia was divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They all joined NATO. So all that Stalin had done with after the Second World War, getting into agreements with Churchill and Roosevelt about how to divide up Europe, because sometimes we think that the Soviet Union just came over and took over Eastern Europe. It was all agreed, actually. Okay, so during the conference at Tehran in 1943, the conference at Yalta in 1944, the three main, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the Potsdam Conference at 1945, agreed to the boundaries. This is now Eastern Europe under our influence. This is Western Europe under your influence, and that's it. And all that was given up as the Russians saw it in 2001. They had all been countries that belonged to the Warsaw Pact, as I said, equivalent of NATO. And, of course, they were quite happy because under Article 5, as we know, if one country gets attacked, the others come in their defense. And obviously, perhaps they felt, oh my God, perhaps Russia one day will come to attack us because we are no longer under their influence. Okay, so I can understand that. Although Article 5 does not say explicitly that they will come to your help. It says that they will consider whether to come or not. I mean, there is an opening there for some dissident voices, as it were. But in any case, these new independent countries felt that they would be protected from Russia just in case, okay, under NATO. So they were, I'm sure, quite happy to do so. There are two countries, actually three, if we count Georgia, two countries that do not join NATO. One of them refuses to do so, Belarus. Ukraine is sort of in between, is hesitant at that time. We could say neutral, but is hesitating. So it didn't go into NATO at that time. Belarus, that said no, specifically no, governed by Lulachenko. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. And he feels that he's going to be loyal, at least not betray, as he said, Russia. He refuses to enter NATO, stays there, as he said later, because I'm not going to allow anyone to think about the possibility of coming and stabbing Russia on the back. So he's there. He refuses to join NATO. He has not been forgiven for this, as a matter of fact, because you remember, I don't know that you remember or not, but there was an attempted coup not long ago, perhaps in 2020 or 2021, against him. It didn't succeed. Anyway, so Ukraine nevertheless signs this agreement about Crimea, Sevastopol, with Russia. And here, and I'm going to quote this author, this French author, Francois Asselinau, he says specifically, don't know whether you'll agree with him, but he says the US nevertheless is not satisfied. The US, he says, always wants more. And the US and the EU are now working in tandem. End of quote. All right, so this is going to cause problems. The US, it seems that, in his opinion at any rate, did not want to leave well enough alone. Instead of being satisfied already, with the geopolitical control that they already had over Eastern Europe anyway. He then moves on and decides to apply the Zbigniew Brzezinski's theory. You've heard about this too, yes. He had worked as the Secretary of State for President Carter and later also for President Obama. And he understood geopolitics, and he wrote a book which is now like, the Bible, as it were, for the so-called neocons. It's called the Grand Chessboard, in which he clearly states and explains that if the US manages to get Ukraine out of that Russian sphere, to join the West completely, not neutral, no, to come and join the West, if the United States achieves that, to cut it off from Russia completely, including, as I said, the neutrality thing, that would be the end of Russia, the absolute end of Russia. Indubitably, he said, forever. They will have nothing to do anymore. Ukraine, he saw, was that vital. So Ukraine, it was not enough for Ukraine to remain neutral, one foot here, the other foot there. Bring it to the Western sphere. So now we can agree, disagree, not care about this theory, but this is the theory that is being applied now. Ukraine, therefore, has become to represent for the United States a challenge to Russia, a geopolitical challenge to Russia, a geostrategic challenge to Russia, a symbol, if you like, of US power. This is the challenge that we have to understand, and it means, on the other side, that Russia, not Putin, because we always say Putin, okay, the Russian leadership actually will never, we can never say never, but never, never, ever accept that. In other words, they're following the same script. Never accept to have Ukraine on the side of the US empire as they see it. They will never agree to that. They will accept Ukraine being neutral, but not wholly on the side of NATO, of the United States. All right, so here we are. I don't know whether you watched a very recent interview with Tucker Carlson and President Orban from Hungary, and he explains the Russian mentality very well. Perhaps you have, but he says that, you see, in the West, if you say, okay, what is the most important thing in politics for you, for your country, and so on, people will say freedom, freedom of speech, freedom for this, freedom for that. He says that's not the Russian mentality. The Russian mentality before all that, that could be second, third, fourth, but before that is the keeping the integrity of the country, the geographical integrity. That, for them, it is more important. Freedom and so on will come afterwards, and it's something that the West perhaps cannot understand very well. Not surprising, if look at where they are. Okay, huge country. Okay, if the United States did not have two oceans, one on either side, and weak people, weak, not as certainly not as powerful Mexico or Canada. Okay, if they were surrounded by countries which had invaded them, I don't know many times, perhaps keeping the country together against invading forces would be also an American, number one. To me, I don't find that difficult to understand. So, Russian security above all, that is what they understand. Now, moving on. The Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. Okay. We come to 2013, 2014. The president of the Ukraine is still, I don't want to say hesitant. I think I forget his name because I always get them mixed up, so I don't want to say it. But in 2013, 2014, at that time, what the president was trying to do is, look, let's see, to get an advantage from both sides. Let's see what I can get from Russia. I'm willing to trade. I'm willing to listen. Let's see what I can get from the European Union. Let's see what they offer, and so on. But the Americans felt that he was tilting towards Russia, and that was a problem. They wanted Ukraine in NATO, in the European Union. So, in 2013, 2014, we have this revolution. Okay, this is a coup. Okay, I think there is enough evidence to know that the United States was fostering this coup. Well, one specific instance is, Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State. And the Russians actually caught her on the telephone. And there is a conversation with the American ambassador to Kiev, Jeffrey R. Piat. And 1 month before the coup, 1 month before the revolution thing, she is dictating to him who is going to be in the new government. The ministers, everybody. Okay. And one of the questions that the ambassador, of all the things she is saying, the ambassador says that perhaps the European Union would not quite agree to certain things, and she just says, F the European Union. And it's there, there are recordings of it, you can hear it. Okay, so among the people that she chose, there are politicians, but then some weird people, like some boxers there, and some but some say some ultra-nationalists, let's say, such as, for example, the Svodova party, it means liberty, or the Pravdi sector, which means law. And some people have said that these were, neo-Nazis or ultra-nationalists, as it said. Those are going to be in the government. Then we see many Western leaders visiting Kiev after the coup. So now we are going to see the direct intervention of the United States, of Nato. And the involvement also of some Western military armies. The Canadians, for example, started working as assessors to the National Guard of Ukraine and the Ukrainian army, that some have claimed were really on this extreme right. All right. If the word, it has to be said, because when we say, for example, that they were ultra-nationalist, I don't want to use the word too much, but they mean that they followed and greatly esteemed certain personages from the 1940s, yes, Stefan Bandera and so on, who were the ones, the leaders who had aligned themselves with the Germans and so on. There's a whole history here. But they were all Ukrainians from that western part of Ukraine, from the Ukrainian speakers, okay? The symbol of this anti-Russian sentiment that had never really died down. So this is what happens after the Maidan coup in 2013-2014. We start to see problems with what is happening on the ground there between the western part of Ukraine, those Russians, and the eastern part of Ukraine. The western part, the Ukrainians, and the eastern part, the Russian part. Now, the eastern part, Lugansk, Donetsk, and so on, felt oppressed about what was going on. Their language was banned. We began to see a little bit of that loathing and hatred coming to the fore openly. We hear from the western side referring to the Russian children. When I say Russian, you understand that I mean Ukrainians, but on the eastern part. Officials of the government saying things like, while Ukrainian children will be singing songs at school, those Russian children, using an insult, will be there in misery in their basements and things like that. So that doesn't help. All this was going on in 2014. So things are getting now very dangerous and kind of very dirty, really. While all this is brewing, Crimea, that is still belongs to the Ukraine, even though, as I have said, Russia and the Ukraine had an agreement that the Navy could be there. while all these problems are brewing between the West and the East, there has been a successful coup. Everything is changing towards Ukraine being very, very much part of Nato and the European Union. What Russia sees is clearly that if things continue like this, with the coup and everything, what Putin sees is that, of course, this agreement will soon be broken with the Navy in Crimea, and that Ukraine will become, it looks that way anyway, more and more, will become part of NATO, and therefore the US will take and occupy Crimea, for sure. Probably the first thing that they would do. Sevastopol being the biggest Russian port in the world, with access to the Black Sea, to the Mediterranean, to the world. Okay, the port of the Russian Navy. So Putin moves in and takes it. Russians probably would say he took it back. But anyway, he took it. He knows his history, he reacted, takes it in his mind before the other one does, as it were. A preemptive strike, as it were. And what he will not allow is for Sevastopol to be in the hands of NATO. That is 2014. Crimeans have always been part of Russia, well, since the 18th century. Crimeans speak Russian, are of Russian culture. They didn't mind this at all, the people. But he took it. True, the way he does it is a little bit rushed, and it does go against international law, because Crimea belonged to Ukraine. So, for sure. He probably thought, well, the US is not known for respecting international law when it goes against her interests either, but never mind, okay. The Crimean people accepted it in an open referendum. It wasn't, it wasn't, they didn't cheat. I mean, there were polls and people, assessors and so on. So 95% of the people wanted to go back to Russia. So the people were okay with that. Now, so what has happened is that, in fact, what he did against international law, it has to be said, but nevertheless, probably the way they saw it is, we are going to take back the gift that Khrushchev gave to you in 1954. We are taking it back, sorry. That's probably the way they... So this annexation of Crimea, you remember, it was a great, great scandal. That is how, everybody talked about it. The US, Canada, the EU saw it. And they would refer to the whole international community is against it. And so the international community for the US and Britain is the US, Britain, Canada, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and probably, yes, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. Okay, so it was a total scandal. Actually, sometimes they have been... I tell you an anecdote here, nothing to do with Ukraine. You know this thing that they have, I think is baseball, that they have this competition, the World Series, and many people laugh at the Americans. The World Series, and this is just baseball only played in the United States. Actually, you know what I learned? The World Series is only called that because the people who sponsored the competition, I think in the 1920s, was a newspaper called The World. And it was at the beginning the World newspaper, the World newspaper competition. Then they just shortened it to the World Series. So it's we have to understand that too. Anyway, so why was this so scandalous, though? Okay. Not because Crimea had been returned officially or unofficially, technically, to Russia, but because they saw it as a failure on their part not to have managed to take it, this maritime jewel. He actually did it before they did. That was what hurt, I think. Freedom and democracy and the Crimean people, no. He just beat you to it, as it were. But from this moment on, everything is going to degenerate tremendously into a sort of a spiral. The Russian Ukraine decides, those two, republics decide to proclaim their autonomy from the main government, from the legitimate government, from Kiev. And this is major. The Eastern Ukraine part is not actually all that huge. It's not gigantic. It's about 80,000 square kilometers. Not a gigantic piece of territory, but it is where the people feel Russian, speak Russian, and so on and so forth. It's Russian culture. So they proclaim themselves independent. Now, of course, this rupture is now out there in the open. What follows, I think, could be called something like a civil war to begin with. The official Ukraine, the Kiev government, starts increasingly bombing and shelling this other part of Ukraine, this other part of the country. But things are moving very rapidly, and it really is degenerating into a proper civil war between the two sides. So what happens? The Minsk Accords. Okay. So Minsk is in Belarus, is the capital of Belarus. Russia officially does not take part. It's what in diplomacy you call an observer. Okay. Who the parties that take part in this agreement is the government of Ukraine and these two self-proclaimed republics, autonomous republics that want out of Ukraine. The legitimate government, let's say the Kiev, the capital, accepts to give these two eastern regions autonomy. They even accept that they will, of course, be allowed to keep their own language, which had been banned, and so on. All this is accepted officially. so everything is fine, no? No. They had agreed to it, but they didn't follow through. Had they been perhaps a little bit more honest, I think, had they really carried out these things that they had agreed to, these conditions, there would perhaps not have been a war between Russia and Ukraine. And Donetsk and Lugansk would still be part of Ukraine today, with a certain autonomy, perhaps what we call here in Britain a sort of a devolved government, something like that. Russia in all this is, as I said, an observer. And what does it observe? What it observes is that the agreements are only on paper, but that the government is not actually following through, unfortunately. Things get worse. They continue with the shelling of the eastern part. There are many incidents. I mean, one famous one where they corral people, about 50 people in a building, and they set fire to it, and people were burnt alive, and all kinds of things. This is a civil war now. Okay, and things happened in civil wars. So actually nothing has changed on the ground. It's actually becoming worse and worse, which means that the more it goes on, the worse it gets. It happens in civil wars. And therefore, the worse it gets, the more the loathing and the hatred for the other side. Inevitable. To the point where these two republics decide that they might have to get their own militias to fight back all the shelling from the other side. So things are bad already, okay? So what does Russia... eventually Zelensky, yes, things are so bad that when he runs, he was picked, okay, by an oligarch, and he runs on, he would bring back peace between the two sides. He is a native Russian speaker. He had to, when he got elected, he had to learn Ukrainian sort of in a hurry. But he's a native Russian speaker, and people believed him. He said, I will bring peace. We will end all this war. Fantastic. Everybody voted for him. Then things changed for whatever reason. I'm just giving an introduction here. I'm not going into details, so you know that things changed because there is a war going on. Okay, so those that Minsk agreement was not carried through, was not enforced. So what does Russia do? Calls for a Minsk agreement 2. They will meet again. Keeps itself again diplomatically as an observer. But this time what changes is that it's not just Kiev and the two republics. France and Germany come in as guarantors. So what they're saying, what are they doing there? Well, guarantors, they will ensure and guarantee that whatever is agreed upon there in those meetings, and the consensus that they reach, whatever it is, will be done, will be followed through. It hadn't in the previous one. Now there are going to be guarantors that this will take place. So there they are, the two Ukrainian republics, the Ukrainian government, and France and Germany. Unfortunately, as we have come to know recently, about a year ago, it was a little bit of a farce. It was a little bit of a ruse, really. Why? Because it wasn't real. They were just pretending. What do I mean pretending? Well, you've heard this before. they were pretending because, as the ex-French Prime Minister Hollande has said officially, as the ex-German, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel herself also said, as the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, I get the names confused, they have all said it, that the Minsk II agreement was not to be implemented. The real reason was to waste time, extend time in preparation for the West to arm and train the Ukrainian army to be equipped and trained by Nato. And so they were going to need time, and in the meantime they pretended that, you know, they were going to implement all this. Now, preparing the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian army, for what? For war. For war with whom? To attack who exactly? I remember seeing videos where they, after these two Minsk agreement, and they are all there, France and Germany, and Putin is there too, just talking to the official something or other, and Zelensky is there too. And Putin believes that this is real, is reading the official thing, and this is, you know, what is going to happen in there. And Zelensky is sneering and laughing his head off while Putin is reading through his notes. There are videos there. He's just there saying, that took me aback, because, I mean, even if that is what you are doing, that you know is a farce, I would say, Mr. President, at least have the class not to be laughing and sneering. I mean, the French and the Germans are there, you know, yeah. And he's sneering. I didn't think that was nice. Anyway. Okay, so what happens next? No, they don't follow through. They don't implement it. On the contrary, there's on the contrary, there is more force and more violence to actually force them to integrate them back into the Ukraine. Okay, so it escalates all the time. By this time, obviously, the Ukraine is totally on the side of the West, looking to the West, to NATO, to the European Union. The European Union, who, it would seem, are well disposed to this conflict continuing, and are, in fact, sometimes throwing more fuel into the fire. Things are already very bad. This is a full-scale civil war now. And, okay. That is how Russia understood it, I think. What Russia wanted was the Ukraine to be neutral. That's the main thing, not to be in the orb of the United States. Yeah. Of course, I understand. Look, I understand. Many of you will say, look, that's all right. Ukraine is an independent country, is a sovereign country, and such has the perfect right to do whatever he wants. And if he wants to be part of the European Union, and if he wants to be part of NATO, then that's its prerogative. Why not? I understand. That's one very powerful argument. But the problem is, you see, that you must not forget that within Ukraine itself there is a huge problem there. Officially, the government and so on may want to be part of the Ukraine, but that does not get rid of that problem, that there is part of the Ukraine that does not want to. And so you have a problem, an inner problem there. We have to understand that the people, how terrible a situation it is, that the people within one same country are divided, and that the central government at this point, is not an exaggeration, continues to shell and bomb that part. And so you have a country where people are themselves divided into two camps, and the problem does not go away just by saying that Ukraine is a sovereign country, independent country, and it may choose to do whatever it pleases. The government, yes, but you still have that problem there. How are you going to solve that problem? You can negotiate. You can do it by force. How are you going to solve it? At the moment, it's force that is being used. There has been an attempt to say, okay, let's work it out. No, it hasn't worked. They haven't implemented that. So you still have that problem. We see that if continued, it would degenerate more and more and more. It's already degenerated into a bloody civil war, really. What the Minsk agreements were trying to resolve, was trying to resolve this situation, to give it some kind of resolution. You have a country where one part looks to the west and the other part looks to the east. That is what has to be resolved in some way. The Minsk agreements were a good try to find a solution, and to make matters worse, it is not only a civil war between two parts of this same one nation, but also a geopolitical problem, which has to, whether you like it or not, involve Russia. If this nation is going to be part of the West, then it not only affects the two sides, but affects Russia too. If Russia is going to have NATO right there at the border. So to say, well, they can do whatever they want, they are sovereign, yes, but you have to take into account a lot of other factors too. What everybody says, if the Russians had, the nukes there in Mexico, what did the United States do? Just say, oh, well, Mexico is a sovereign country? No, you have to take more things into account here. Okay. Moscow thinks, and I think it has good reasons to think, that if Ukraine becomes a part of NATO, as it had already happened with the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all the others, pretty soon Russia will have nuclear weapons right there on its border. Yes, obviously you can say, and with reason, but if Ukraine wants to join the EU, for example, sure, after all, as we all know, Putin is a terrible person, okay, a dictator who wants to be with him, okay. And Ukraine is a democracy and a sovereign state, okay. You think that, fine. I understand where you're coming from on this, but your reasoning here is not taking into account and avoiding something which is very crucial, and that is reality, the relationships of power politics. Let me explain. If we go back to 1962, okay, you've heard this comparison before. You have to be over 70 to remember. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, in 1962, Khrushchev, then the Soviet leader, and took missiles to Cuba, which is about 100 kilometers away from Florida. It's exactly the same situation in a mirror. Khrushchev decides to send and install missiles in the island of Cuba. What is the objective of that? Obviously, the United States. As I said, it's 100 kilometers from Florida. The same distance, by the way. Yeah. So here we are in 1962. There are no intercontinental missiles then. Those will be produced in the next decades. So these missiles are really threatening the United States, obviously. And President Kennedy demands that they be uninstalled and so on. Or a third world war might ensue. So he's aware of the risks. A war between two nuclear superpowers. Even President de Gaulle, who didn't particularly like Americans very much, he was at that time trying to disentangle France from what he called American influence. De Gaulle always thought that the European countries were becoming very subservient to the United States. Some argue that they have become so, but he would not agree to be within Nato. And anyway, another video. But in any case, even though he's not particularly enamored of all things American, he nevertheless stands clearly here on the side of the US, because he really believes, as practically everybody else did, that this was clearly a provocation. Now, there is something here that a lot of people don't know. I think a lot of Americans don't know, and that is that the whole situation about the missiles to send them to Cuba was that the United States had put missiles in Turkey, facing the Soviet Union. And in retaliation, Khrushchev sent them to Cuba. And here you have two people saying, no, you take them out. And you, okay, we're not going to argue who should have done it first. This is not a game. This is practically nuclear war. This is it's not a matter of who blinks first or who has more hairs on his chest. It's a question of President Kennedy, who took the missiles from Turkey first, is perhaps the more mature here, the more of a statesman. This is not a game. Assuring himself that Khrushchev would remove the missiles from Cuba, he says, okay, I'll take them from Turkey. But anyway, both responsible leaders came very close and then decided against nuking the world, as it were. But you can see what the argument is. If nukes were put in Mexico along the Rio Grande, of course they would not be tolerated by the United States. There is a Cuban proverb, by the way, which says, the Cuban says, ay, 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 so far from God and so near the United States. Anyway, look, it's like this. When you are, whichever country you happen to be, okay, big, small, halfway in between, when your geographical luck has been to be next door to a nuclear superpower, there are things that you have to consider. Police. There are things that you have to consider. To say, I am a sovereign country and therefore I'm going to do whatever I want is not enough, because you're going to annihilate yourself. There are other things, if you are responsible, that you have to take into account. It's not just you are a sovereign nation and you can do whatever you like. Not that simple. If you are its equal, then fine, go to war if you like. Okay, who kills each other first? But if you are a little mouse here, and next door you have Godzilla, as Professor Mearsheimer always refers to the United States as Godzilla. Okay, there are things that you have, if you are that little mouse, there are things that you have to consider for your own survival. Okay, so if the US would not tolerate missiles in their border with Mexico, and they would be absolutely right in not tolerating them, of course, this is exactly the same thing. The same thing for Russia will not tolerate nukes in Ukraine, next door to it. Oh, but Ukraine is sovereign, so is Mexico, we think. But it's really exactly the same if you think about it. Okay, so Putin, and it's not just President Putin, we all fall into saying Putin because of, I think it's because of this American insistence of always identifying the enemy and giving it a name, you know, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Putin. You know. It is not just Putin, it is the whole Russian leadership, I think, that you have to agree, that will never accept, never accept to have the United States, NATO, but still the United States, right there on their border. End of story, never. Now, so what do you do? You may not like it, but, you know, that is how it is. So what do we do in a situation like this? First, I think, and I'm going to quote, continue with the idea, but certainly the quote of this author, this French author, Francois Asselinau. He says, for a start, the West has to stop mocking the Russian bear and not taking it seriously. That if it stops thinking that if you are aggressive enough against Russia, Russia will give up and they will raise the white flag, that Russia will end up conceding here. And I think that's right. I think there is a certain dismissal of Putin here. Putin is a very intelligent man. He's not an idiot. But we treat him almost, I don't know, there is a certain contempt and not taking it seriously. Yeah. Why? Putin has been saying since 2005, when the West said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO, he said no, that will not happen. And we never took him seriously. What can he do about it? Well, he can do a lot about it. We don't take him, the West does not take him seriously, not until recently anyway. They're becoming, I think, a little bit more worried now, perhaps more than a little, but in any case. He has been treated very contemptuously. And he's not only intelligent, but he's very, very, very patient. He's not going to rush. Yes, the Americans at first thought that they would win because, you know, their experience of war since the Second World War, you know, in countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and so on, they go in with extreme air power, they bomb everything is flattened, and that's it, and they won. Oh, and then what? Well, it's a strategy, to be sure, but what happens next to that? To just going in and flattening everything. Everything is destroyed, yes, but I think we have to say that the United States haven't won a war since the Korean War, and even that was a draw. So the Russians' strategy is not to just go in and flatten everything. They have a different strategy. Okay. So Putin knows that he's fighting NATO, not the Ukraine. In the Ukraine already, they have already destroyed the third army. They're destroying NATO equipment. We keep sending stuff. It's destroyed. They're waiting there. Okay. They seem to be in no hurry. I don't know about war, so I don't know. But certainly a different strategy, it seems to me. Because I think that if they wanted to just flatten, absolutely bomb Kiev, the capital, perhaps they would have done it. I think they're capable of doing that. So why don't they do that? I don't think we ask ourselves sometimes, obvious questions. Anyway, so, whether we like it or not, there it is. That's how it is. So what do we do in a situation like this? Look, there are different strategies, as I said. Okay, I've already told you about what President Orban said, about that we are not reading the Russians well. For them, the main thing is to keep the country. Anything else comes afterwards. Maintaining the country together. Now, I looked this up. Let me just tell you, you say, well, they're paranoid. Well, okay, perhaps they're paranoid, but if you're paranoid, you're paranoid. But perceptions are real, as they say, right? So let me give you here some invasions from the West. Russia being invaded. That's not all of them. We are not going to go back to the 13th century of the Mongols or anything. Okay, let's start in the 1700s. I got this from somewhere. The most notable invasions include, first, the Great Northern War between 1700 and 1721, in which Russia was invaded by Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark, Norway. Wow. Okay. 2. The Russo-Turkish War of 1787-1792, in which Russia was invaded by the Ottoman Empire. That is where the Crimean thing comes in. Okay. 3rd, the most important, the Napoleonic Wars, 1812 to 1815, in which Russia was invaded by France. World War I, 1914 to 1918, in which Russia was invaded by Germany and Austria-Hungary. whatever number it is. Next, World War II, 1939 to 1945, in which Russia was invaded by Germany. These are just the most notable. It is also worth noting that there have been other instances of military conflicts between Russia and European countries throughout history, such as the Russo-Polish War of 1919-1921, the Russo-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940. Okay, so here you are surrounded by all this country. You have been invaded 1 million times. I think perhaps there is you can afford to be paranoid. I don't think they are. I really don't. Well, perhaps, I don't know. But anyway, it answers this question that President Orbán said, that for them the most important thing is always to be ready to fight for any possible invasion or whatever, to keep the integrity of the country. So now we seem to have reached the point of no return. What is going to happen now? Where are we going? A nuclear threat now? Okay, so Russia is second, perhaps now first, nuclear power. The US for sure has superior material in some areas, okay? But now a lot of material Russia has that is far ahead. I read, for example, that, let me see, hypersonic missiles, the S-300 and the S-400, I don't know what they are or what they are capable of, but the hypersonic, you will understand it. On this, for example, the Russians are 10 to 15 years ahead. The military is trained. I mean, okay. So my point is that if you are to confront a military power as strong and as huge as Russia, independently of what you think or do not think about Russia, you have to start from the actual reality of who you are fighting. And the real situation, apart from hopes and illusions and dreams, is reality. You know that a very famous Chinese proverb that says, if you spend your life dreaming and hoping, you'll spend your life half asleep. Oh, confront the reality of the situation on the ground. Putin was really exasperated for 7 or 8 years when Kiev was continuously bombing and shelling the Lugansk and the Donetsk. And the people there were asking for help, and he knew that he would get into trouble if he did come in. That would have meant war and so on. So he was getting... Anyway, the Russian people, and in spite of his 2 efforts to get the Minsk agreements going, nothing was happening. And nothing, it seemed, was going to solve what was going on. So that is the question. Why did he intervene? Okay? Perhaps he went mad one day. Perhaps he reached that point, the realization that he had to go to war. After all, he's an evil man. He woke up one morning on the 24th of February 2022, and having nothing else to do, he decided to invade Ukraine. Perhaps he's mad. Perhaps he's insane. Perhaps he's dying of cancer of the liver, cancer of the brain, heart attacks, this and that, whatever. And since he is an evil man, He said one day, before I go to meet my maker, I will do a really, really evil thing and kill lots of people. I think we have to stop looking down on him. As Americans do, they do. Not Americans, not the people, but very unwise Americans in power now. We can be mad at him, we can loathe him, we can be scandalized by him, but whatever he is not going to let Americans dismantle and break down his country into zones, divide it up into 4, 5 zones, and appropriate its reserves. If he has to go down, he will go down. But he's not going to allow it to happen. So he wants to keep his country intact according to its history. However much you disagree, that is the reality. So now we run the risk, if not of a new nuclear confrontation, well, we run the risk of a nuclear confrontation. 2 nuclear superpowers. If the West continues to believe that Ukraine will be part of NATO and not neutral, that is what they want, Putin wants neutrality. Okay, so how do we resolve it? Okay, let's conclude. Let us at least accept this, that this is not about freedom and democracy. Okay, you know, when they take us, someone says, when everything fails, they take you to war. Gerald Celente, he's funny. Can we accept that this is, they cannot just say, this is about democracy, this is about freedom. It's come on. That is not true. Those are lies. It is not about retaining this great democracy in Ukraine. But even if it were, you could argue that the US actually, and this is what we see, you see, unless I cover my eyes, I have to see it, I'm sorry. The US is choosing what democracies it likes and, you know, the ones that, or dictatorships that it likes, dictatorships that it doesn't like, if Putin is a dictator. Or the democracies it likes and the democracies it doesn't like. They don't seem to be terribly bothered about democracy or lack of it in other countries. We don't need to mention them. We can name many. Never mind in the Middle East, I mean Latin America. How many interventions in Latin America, coups, putting this president, taking it out, this and that, since the Second World War, about 250 legal ones. How many coups? How many interventions in Guatemala? I stopped counting. The question is, actually, in which country in Latin America did not the US intervene? And why do they intervene? If the person in power, whether he's elected or is not elected, whatever, if he goes against the interest of the United States, he is removed in one way or another. Bahrain has the American, the fifth fleet of the American Navy. No one ever mentions that. What I'm saying is, look, I understand, I'm trying to understand power politics, but what I am saying is that this is not about freedom, democracy, love. Okay, there's something else, yeah? There's geopolitical issues here involved about power, just raw power, okay? So why is the US appearing to seek some conflict here? Well, that's a fair question to ask. I can accept that, the United States is going against, wants to fight Russia for. Okay. Why? Well, some cynics would say that it's getting a whiff of those hydrocarbons, oil, petrol, gas. And Americans are angry at Russia. They have been furious at Russia now for many years. Why? Well, there was this, you remember, negotiation taking place for a long time between Germany and Russia about supplying gas from Russia to Germany and so to the European Union and so on, very cheap. It would seem as if one of the US objectives was actually to separate firmly Europe from Russia. Not only because of cheap energy, but also because of other links, economic, cultural, political, scientific, etc. It's important to understand that for the United States, Europe is, and I'm quoting my guy here, Francois Asselinau, is little more than the spoils of war, going back, he says, to just after the Second World War, with the creation first of the common market, which they urge Europe to do, keep in tight control the European Economic Community, then the European Union. And this author feels that they are keeping control like that. So the European countries have become a little bit more than colonies. That's very hard for us Europeans to accept. But look, it's not that difficult actually, because the US, like, if it is a colonial power, it's a different one, isn't it? It inherited all the plumbing from the British Empire. The aqueducts were already built, kind of thing. Not the water, but the pipes were already there. So if it is a colonial power, every colonial power in the history of mankind has done the same. Has tried to impose its way of life onto the colonized countries. Right, wrong, that is what they have all done. So they are not the only ones. But also, not only its way of life, but commerce, whatever, for its own benefit. They have all done it. Others countries would say, I am an empire and you are my servant. Okay, well, that's too gross now to say that. But, they have behaved as such, and that is okay. So if the United States wants to sell its own energy, liquefied gas, to Germany, to Europe. Germany used to receive about 50-60% of the gas from Russia. Very cheap, as I said. So having defined Putin as that evil wolf the US now forces Germany to give up on that Nord Stream 2, and they destroy it. We know that at present there is no equal substitute for what Germany lost there. Qatar has already had the contracts signed off to someone else and has no capacity for overproduction of any kind. Okay, so I'm going to end up, because I think I'm going to do one more on this. And my thing was just to present, basically, not to argue what is going on now or what is going to happen in the future, but to just to give you a little bit of a summary, in summary form, of the history of how we came to where we were, let's say in 2022 when the war started. I'm going to leave it there because my voice is just going. Okay, please subscribe if you would do me that favor, if you have stayed with me. Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.